Good evening, everyone, and welcome back to From the Other Side, streaming live from Minsk, Belarus. I'm your host, and tonight we've got the show packed with insight, intensity, and a hard look at the shifting balance of global power. The world right now isn't just divided, it's being re-engineered. The West's illusion of control is crumbling, and what's rising in its place is a multipolar order that refuses to bow. Tonight, we're diving straight into that confrontation, from the ideological to the economic, from the digital to the geopolitical. This is live show 149, Global Power Shifts. We'll begin with Russia's Western Showdown, breaking down Moscow's evolving strategy amid total confrontation with the West, a contest no longer fought in secret, but on every front, political, economical, and psychological. Then we'll turn to the art of staging, strategic staging, exploring how the US now faces the limits of its empire, struggling to avoid a global collision as it juggles conflicts with Russia, China, and Iran. Can Washington still play chess on three boards at once, or has the board itself turned against it? We'll also expose how the West targets economic infrastructure in targeting Russia's economy, using think tanks and sanctions as modern siege warfare. From there, we'll pull back the curtain on the illusion of deterrence, how NATO's obsession with dominance has manufactured global chaos rather than prevented it, and how the real illusion is collapsing in real time. In Ukraine's Tomahawk Hurdles, we'll unpack why the proposed delivery of US cruise missiles to Kiev isn't just a military aid story. It's a red line that could drag NATO directly into war. Then it's Europe at the crossroads, a continent de-industrialized, de-legitimized, and decoupling from itself. We'll examine how European elites obsessed with Washington's approval has sacrificed autonomy, energy, and prosperity for the illusions of unity. And we'll follow that with a Dear NATO EU message from ordinary people across the continent who are saying enough of endless wars, collapsing economies, and elites who blame everyone but themselves. And then we'll turn to the UK, where the so-called Brit card digital ID is being marketed as convenience, but looks more like an opening act of digital tyranny, an app-based system of total control over citizens' movement, data, and identity. And finally, we'll just check out what Dynamo Minsk has been doing this week in the KHL. So buckle up, because tonight's show isn't about headlines. It's about patterns, it's about power, and it's about seeing the world as it really is, not as the Western media tells you it should be. Welcome to From the Other Side, where truth heralds the dawn of awareness. So tonight we begin what can only be described as defining moment in modern geopolitics, Russia's Western Showdown. What we're witnessing now isn't a temporary tension or another diplomatic standoff. It's the accumulation of years of betrayal, deceit, and confrontation. The political landscape between Russia and the collective West has changed forever. Let's go back for a moment. The United States, after those failed talks in Anchorage, essentially shut the door on dialogue with Moscow. What followed was a complete collapse of diplomacy. The Trump administration couldn't rally NATO around a peace deal. And they've determined to do the opposite, to pursue Russia's strategic defeat. That meant one thing, an all-out proxy war. But Washington's strategy isn't just military, it's economic warfare on every front. The sanctions, the frozen assets, and now even direct interference with Russian trade. Just look at what happened recently in France. A Russian tanker inspected at Saint-Nazaire. That wasn't routine, that was a signal, and Macron is openly calling for this kind of pressure to expand. Now here's where it gets interesting, because Russia has options. Moscow can respond asymmetrically, perhaps by inspecting or detaining vessels from those same countries. But there's also the nuclear dimension no one in Brussels or Washington wants to talk about, that Russia might decide it's time to demonstrate resolve, not through words, but through action. A single strike on a weapons depot in Poland, for example, would instantly change the entire dynamic. That's not speculation, That's strategic signaling. And if it's the West that were to respond on Russian territory, the consequences could escalate fast, even to the tactical nuclear level. Just remember, the US walked away from Anchorage, Russia didn't, and by walking away, Washington gave Moscow a free hand in Ukraine. What were once limited objectives, like demilitarization or neutrality, are gone. Russia's new vision is far broader. We're talking about integration of most of the former Ukrainian state into the Russian Federation, securing Nikolaevia, securing Odessa, and ensuring what remains of Ukraine poses no threat to the Russian world. This isn't about lands for land's sake, it's about survival, the survival of the Russian state itself. To achieve that, Russia is preparing to mobilize everything, politically, economically, and militarily. That includes total destruction of critical infrastructure used against it. Yes, readiness for a limited nuclear confrontation in Europe if the West pushes too far. And make no mistake, the only language the West still understands is power. Russia's message is clear. There's no middle ground anymore. This is either victory or defeat. And there's the key point. Russia's not fighting for conquest, it's fighting for balance, for a new European order where sovereignty replaces subservience and where nations finally live free from the suffocating grip of Western hegemony. So when we talk about showdown, understand, it's not just a military one, it's civilizational. Russia redefining the rules of power, and as history has shown, when the motherland stands united, no empire, no alliance, and no sanctions regime can break it. That's why this confrontation, however dangerous, will ultimately mark the birth of a new multipolar world, a world built not on coercion, but on strength, sovereignty, and truth. And that is what's really at stake in Russia's Western Showdown. Now let's shift from Moscow to Washington, because that's what's happening on the other side of this geopolitical chessboard is just as telling. This next segment is called The Art of Strategic Staging, and it asks a question that no one in Washington seems brave enough to answer honestly. Can the United States fight three major powers, Russia, China, and Iran, at the same time? Or is America finally realizing that its empire has stretched too far? For the first time in decades, the US finds itself at the brink of total overload, its wars, its alliances, and its ambitions, all colliding at once. The strikes on Iran's nuclear sites in June brought a brief moment of calm, a breath of relief, but that moment's already fading. You see, for 30 years, America believed it could do anything, everywhere, all at once, from the Balkans to Baghdad, from Kabul to Kiev. The world was its chessboard. But that illusion of omnipotence is dead. The 2020s have exposed the limit of American power. China is outproducing the West in both industry and innovation, building a parallel system of global trade and technology. Russia has reignited the continental war in Europe, one that NATO cannot win without tearing itself apart. And Iran, despite constant threats and sanctions, continues to wage successful proxy wars across the Middle East. This is what strategists call the problem of simultaneity. Three conflicts, three theatres, three crises, all happening at once, and America can't afford to fight them all. So what's the answer? Washington calls it sequencing, the idea of staging its wars one at a time. It's not a new idea. The empires of the past did it for centuries. The Byzantines, the Venetians, the Habsburgs, even the British. They learned that survival wasn't about fighting everyone at once, but knowing who to fight first. In America's case, the message is clear. Iran has been hit, but the next target in Washington's view must be Russia. They see Moscow as a key domino. Taking Russia down, and you send a message to the rest of the world, especially to China, that defiance doesn't pay. That's why US is doubling down on economic warfare. The think tanks are already writing the playbook: total financial isolation, weaponized sanctions, seizure of Russian assets, and the attempt to collapse Russia's energy trade by 2026. They call this breaking the war economy. I call it exactly what it is: economic strangulation on a global scale. And it doesn't stop there. The plan includes pushing Europe to complete abandoned Russian oil and gas, to pour billions into US LNG terminals, and to rebuild its defense industry under Washington's guidance. It's the same colonial pattern: destroy independence, then sell the solution. But here's the irony. This European awakening they talk about isn't about sovereignty, it's about deeper dependency, turning Europe into a military and industrial extension of the US, so Washington can free up its hands for China. And that's the bigger picture. They want Europe to handle conventional deterrence, the local defense, the logistics, the patrols, while the US keeps control of intelligence, nuclear power, and strategy. In other words, Europe pays the bills, while America calls the shots. Of course, there's a problem with this: time. Even the most optimistic analysts in Washington admit they have maybe 4 years before China makes its next big move. So the race is on. Cripple Russia, secure Europe, and then pivot east to Beijing. That's the art they're talking about: strategic staging. But look at what that means in reality. It's not strategy, it's desperation. They're trying to preserve a collapsing empire by burning through its allies. They're draining Europe's resources, weaponizing its economy, and pushing the continent toward a war it can't sustain, all in hope of buying just a few more years of global dominance. And yet history always ends the same way. Every empire that thought it could outlast time itself, from Napoleon's France to Hitler's Germany, eventually learned that one cannot fight everyone at once, and you can't rule forever. The United States still has a choice, but it's running out of time. It can keep chasing the illusion of global control, or it can accept that the world has changed. Because the truth is simple: survival isn't just about strength anymore, it's about timing, and America's clock is ticking. Okay, next up, targeting Russia's economy, exposing vulnerabilities. Of course, in this segment where we pull back the curtain on the so-called quiet war being waged in boardrooms, think tanks and the financial ministries, a war that dresses itself as economics but functions as strategy. Let me be blunt. A recent report from a prominent American think tank is not an objective study. It's a playbook. It maps the pressure points that Western planners believe will force Moscow to the bargaining table, or, failing that, to collapse from within. Here's the uncomfortable truth. They admit in plain language sanctions alone didn't break Russia. Far from it. Moscow adapted. It ramped up defense production, found workarounds for restricting imports, kept oil revenues flowing, and leaned on new partners. In short, the punitive measures have had the opposite effect. They've helped consolidate domestic support and fuel a wartime economy. So what does these strategists identify Russia's weak spots? They list 4. 1. Oil price vulnerability. A big dip in global oil prices in 2025-26 would bite Russian revenues hard. That's why many Western planners hinge on manipulating energy markets indirectly to make sanctions stick where sanctions failed. 2. Foreign currency dependency. The ruble's relative stability still depends on the steady inflows of dollars and euros. Disrupt those channels and you create real pressure. 3. China's role. Beijing's support for Moscow is the single biggest wildcard. Western planners openly discuss ways to de-incentivize Chinese assistance, which, if successful, could isolate Russia economically. 4. Fiscal strain from military subsidies. Heavy state support for defense firms inflates the budget. Over time, that can sap public spending for other priorities and create cracks in social cohesion. Now, note the plan's logic. Immediate collapse proved unrealistic, so the strategy shifts to attrition. Not shock and awe, but slow surgical pressure intended to erode the economy and, crucially, social stability. That means targeting salary streams, supply chains, and everyday economic lifelines of communities that support the war effort. In their calculus, social unrest is a variable path to regime change. That's cold, and that's deliberate. This is a hybrid warfare, sanctions, financial chokes, and engineered strain wrapped in the language of policy papers. It's an attempt to weaponize economics and weight. But let's push back with facts the papers leave out. Russia's wartime mobilization of industry has been extensive. New supply chains, substitution for imports, domestic retooling, these are not incidental. They're structural adjustments, and societies under pressure can respond with cohesion, not collapse. National narratives tighten when people feel threatened. Economies adapt when their survival is on the line. So what should Russia do about this playbook? You don't beat hybrid warfare with more wishful thinking. You answer three ways at once: economic resilience, diplomatic diversification, and targeting countermeasures. Harden financial channels, expand trade partners who won't bend to pressure, and expose the political aim behind these sanctions. Show the public in the West that these measures are designed to break livelihoods, not restore stability. Finally, don't be fooled by timelines scribbled in think tank preferences. These plans assume a passive response, slow media cycles, and fractured democracies. But history proves that strategic coercion often produces backlash and realignment, not submission. This CIS-style blueprint is a warning, not a prophecy. It tells us of what the West wants to do. It does not tell us what will happen. The illusion of deterrence. Alright, let's step back and look at the bigger picture. Tonight's next segment is called The Illusion of Deterrence, and this one's going to get right to the heart of the Western worldview, the myth that controls equals safety, that domination equals peace. For over 30 years, the West has lived by the illusion, from NATO's endless march eastward to Washington's obsession with sanctions and proxy wars. The message was always the same: our power guarantees stability. But look around. What do we actually see? Endless conflict, collapsing economies, broken alliances. The illusion is shattered and the world is moving on. Let's start how we got here. When the Soviet Union fell, there was a genuine chance for peace, a chance for Europe to rebuild without blocks, without threats, without walls. But instead of partnership, NATO chose expansion. From 1999 all the way to 2024, one country after another was pulled into the alliance, each step bringing US weapons closer to the Russia's border. Washington called it security. Moscow called it what it was: encirclement. The promises made in the early 1990s that NATO would not move 1 inch eastward were quietly erased. Each base, each exercise, each missile battery along Russia's frontier made it clear the West never wanted balance, it wanted dominance. And then came 2014, the Western-backed coup in Ukraine. NATO moved in, trained Kiev's army, poured in weapons, and turned what was once a neutral country into a front-line state. By 2022, war wasn't unprovoked, it was inevitable, a direct result of years of Western provocation masquerading as peacekeeping. That's what killed the illusion of deterrence, the moment when defence became aggression and the line between NATO and Ukraine disappeared entirely. But this wasn't about Ukraine. This is global. The same pattern is everywhere. In the Middle East, decades of regime change wars left entire nations destroyed, from Iraq to Libya to Syria. Iran, constantly targeted, learned to fight through proxies and alliances, building a resistance network from Lebanon to Yemen that now counters US-Israeli power. In Europe, energy sanctions backfired spectacularly. They didn't break Russia, they broke Europe. Factories shuttered, energy costs soared, and trust between EU partners collapsed. And in Asia, Washington's attempt to encircle China through AUKUS, Quad, and Taiwan militarization have done exactly what they feared. they pushed Beijing and Moscow closer together. The very alliance the West tried to prevent is now taking shape in plain sight. The result? A multipolar world not built on ideology but on necessity, because every nation that's been sanctioned, threatened, or invaded by the West has learned the same lesson. The only way to survive is to stand together. From Moscow to Beijing, from Tehran to Brasilia, the world is building a new order, one that trades without the dollar, one that defends sovereignty, not submission, one that doesn't ask for permission from Washington to exist. And let's talk about the irony here. The West's favourite weapon, economic sanctions, has now become a trigger for its decline. When the US and the EU froze Russian reserves, they destroyed the credibility of their own banking system. When they sanctioned their biggest energy supplier, they crippled their own industries. Now Europe is facing de-industrialization, inflation, and social unrest, while Russia, China, and Iran adapt and thrive. That's the boomerang effect of empire. The West tried to punish others, but ended up punishing itself. And look at Europe specifically. Brussels still pretends it's in control, but the truth is, European sovereignty now begins and ends in Washington. When the Nord Stream pipelines were destroyed, Europe's energy lifeline, not one NATO government demanded an investigation, not one dared to point a finger. That silence told the entire story. Europe's energy, industry, and autonomy have been sacrificed for someone else's strategy. Now defence budgets are exploding, civil freedoms are shrinking, and the continent once known for diplomacy has become a military outpost for the US interests. That's not unity, that's occupation with better branding. And as all this fold, Western strategists warn of two-front or three-front wars, Russia, China, Iran, as if it's all happening to them. But let's be honest, it's the West that opened every front. In Washington, it's Washington that pushed confrontation in Europe, provoked Beijing in the Pacific, and cornered Iran in the Middle East. They now face the reality they created, a coalition of independent powers that refuse to bow. These nations aren't ideologically allies, they're pragmatic ones. They realise that Western deterrence means permanent subordination. They also chose sovereignty over submission, trade over threats, cooperation over coercion. This isn't the beginning of a new Cold War, it's the end of the old one, the illusion of deterrence. The myth that Western dominance equals global stability has crumbled. As it crumbles, we're watching the birth of something new, a world where power is shared, not imposed. A world built not on coercion but on balance. A world that doesn't need permission from self-proclaimed rules-based order. Because here's the truth, the rules were never universal. They were written by one side for one side, and that side is now losing control. The question facing the West isn't how to preserve dominance, it's whether it can survive without it. History tells us empires rarely step back gracefully, but the illusion is gone. Deterrence has failed, the empire has overreached, and the rest of the world is already moving on. Next we'll bring it down to the battlefield and talk about what all this means to Ukraine, NATO, and the so-called Tomahawk diplomacy that's now pushing conflict into a dangerous new territory. So let's turn now to the Ukraine's Tomahawk Hurdles, because this is where the story is more than just a weapons delivery headline. It exposes the reality behind Western aid, the limits of Ukrainian sovereignty, and the risks of pushing this proxy war into direct NATO involvement. So here's what's happening. There's a growing talk in Washington and London about supplying Ukraine with Tomahawk cruise missiles, the same long-range precision weapons used by US and UK in operations from Iraq to Syria. Now on the surface, that sounds dramatic, the so-called game changer for Kiev, but the truth is far more complicated and frankly far more dangerous. President Putin has recently made it clear Ukraine simply cannot use these missiles on its own. Why? Because Tomahawk isn't some plug-and-play weapon. It's one of the most complex systems in the US arsenal, a product of decades of layered engineering and classified software. To launch one, you need a full access to the mission planning networks, satellite intelligence, and classified US targeting systems. The process can take hours, even days, and every step from route mapping to final guidance runs through American military infrastructure. In short, no US involvement, no launch. So if Kiev gets Tomahawks, it's not really Ukraine fighting them, it's NATO. It's the US or Britain pressing the button behind the curtain. Now let's look at the technical side for the moment. Tomahawks are normally launched from high-end naval vessels, destroyers, submarines, equipped with vertical launch systems. Ukraine doesn't have any of those. Their navy, while resourceful in drones, consists of small corvettes and patrol boats, nothing capable of firing a Tomahawk. They have no submarines, no strategic bombers, no launch infrastructure that can even come close to what's needed. The idea of installing US-made launchers on Ukrainian soil might sound like a workaround, but that would require US or UK technicians, intelligence links, and direct command integration. In other words, active NATO participation. And that's exactly why Moscow has called it a red line. Putin's message was blunt. If Tomahawks appear in Ukraine, it means the US and NATO are directly at war with Russia, and Russia will respond accordingly by targeting not just the missiles, but the launchers and possibly even the bases or ships they come from. This isn't posturing, it's deterrence logic. Once NATO starts operating weapons with a kind of range and dependency, the war crosses into a whole new domain, a de facto NATO-Russia conflict. Even Western analysts quietly admit it. They know Ukraine's military, despite years of Western support, still lacks the infrastructure for weapons like this. Their pilots fly F-16s, but the command systems are still Soviet era. Their navy can disrupt, not dominate. Their army can fight bravely, but it cannot independently manage high-end US weaponry designed for Ukraine forces. So what's really going on? It's not about giving Ukraine the tools to win, it's about escalating slowly, step by step, to test Russia's red lines while keeping plausible deniability. First it was the HIMARS, then ATACMS, then Storm Shadows, and now Tomahawks. Each phase pushes the boundary just a little further, hoping Moscow doesn't call the bluff. But this time the stakes are different, because unlike drones or short-range missiles, the Tomahawk isn't just a weapon, it's an ecosystem. It demands US servers, satellites, networks, software, and trained operators. In other words, it's not an aid package, it's a NATO integration by stealth. Even within the West, the debate is split. Countries like Estonia say give them everything, while others, particularly in Western Europe, are growing nervous. They understand that once these missiles fly, there's no going back. Trump himself has hinted he's considering the move, but even that statement was enough to raise alarm bells in Moscow, Berlin, and Beijing. So the takeaway is this: Ukraine's Tomahawk dream isn't about defense, it's about symbolism. It's meant to project unity, commitment, and deterrence. But in practice, it would mean something far more dangerous, a formal crossing of a line that separates proxy war from open conflict. Because when these missiles launch, the world will know it's not Kiev behind the console, it's Washington and London, and from that point, every strike would carry a risk of global escalation, especially when the Tomahawks can carry nuclear warheads. As of now, October 2025, the debate continues and the clock is ticking. Every new weapon shipment isn't bringing us closer to peace, it's bringing us closer to the unthinkable. Up next, we turn our attention to the crumbling core of Europe itself, a continent de-industrialized, de-legitimized, and decoupling from its own future. That's Europe at the crossroads. Now let's talk about the continent that once thought it would lead the world, but it's now struggling to lead itself. This is Europe at the crossroads, de-industrialized, de-legitimized, decoupling. Europe today isn't facing one crisis, it's facing layers of them, political, economic and social, all unfolding at once. The governments keep changing, but nothing really changes. The people are exhausted, prices are rising, protests are growing, and the legitimacy of the whole European project is starting to crumble. And this didn't happen overnight. It's the result of years, even decades, of choices that looked good on paper but hollowed out the foundations of the continent. Energy transitions made without industrial backups, fiscal problems postponed instead of fixed, and geopolitical strategy that traded Europe's own interests for Washington's agenda. The result, a continent with less power, less confidence, and less control over its own destiny. So let's break that down. At the heart of Europe's identity crisis is a split between two competing visions, integration versus sovereignty. On one side, the Brussels class insists that more Europe is the only answer, more bureaucracy, more rules, more uniformity. And on the other, a growing number of nations, especially in the east, like Hungary, Slovakia, and Czech, are saying enough. They want national decision-making, self-reliance, borders that mean something, and governments that answer to their people, not to their unelected commissars. It's the same divide we've seen in energy, migration, speech, and security, and it's now defining the future of the entire bloc. Take their energy policy. In rushing towards net zero, European leaders dismantled reliable energy system sources before replacing nuclear power was abandoned in several countries, and the continent became dependent on volatile imports, first from Russia, then the spot market. When the war in Ukraine began, that house of cards collapsed, prices exploded, factories shut down, and energy-intense industries began packing up and leaving for places like China, India, or even the United States. That's not environmental progress, that's de-industrialization. And here's the hard question. Was this all a series of mistakes, or was it part of a plan to prepare the continent for something bigger, perhaps a future where total mobilization and control? Because when you depress wages, exhaust savings, and make citizens dependent on the state, they become easier to manage. They accept temporary emergency measures, digital IDs, speech restrictions, even rationing, as long as you tell them it's for security. That's the new Europe being built behind the slogans, a surveillance economy wrapped in progressive branding. Now add that a transatlantic imbalance. Once upon a time, Europe matched the United States in output and innovation. Not anymore. The Americans are now outproducing Europe, attracting its talent and offering cheaper energy and bigger subsidies. And what does Brussels do in response? It doubles down on regulation. It punishes production. It calls that sustainability. So the irony is, Europe is absorbing all the costs of confrontation while America collects the rewards. And then we come to the proxy wars on Europe's borders. Ukraine, Moldova, Georgia. These countries were promised integration into the European family. What they got instead were battlefields, instability, and political engineering that serves Brussels and Washington more than it serves their own people. The same Western logic that destroyed Libya and Iraq is now playing out on Europe's doorstep, but this time it's the EU that's paying the price. Meanwhile, the rest of the world, the so-called Global South, has moved on. They've stopped following Western sanctions. They're trading in local currencies, and they're building institutions like BRICS Plus, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, and the Eurasian supply chains. The West thought sanctions were a weapon. In reality, they've been a teacher. Every time Brussels or Washington tries to isolate someone, they're taught the rest of the world how to live without them. That's what decoupling really means, the world decoupling from the West. And at home, as Europe's power fades, control becomes the substitute. Digital IDs, central bank digital currencies, content policing, they call it modernization. But in reality, it's about compliance. When people can't pay their bills or trust their institutions, the systems tighten the leash. Yet, interestingly, it's Eastern Europe that's leading the resistance. Why? Because they've seen this movie before. Countries that lived under centralized ideological control recognize propaganda when they see it. They've already experienced utopia imposed from above, and they're not buying it again. That's why sovereignist movements are rising in places like Hungary, Slovakia, Serbia, and even Eastern Germany. People who remember what it means to lose sovereignty aren't eager to repeat the experiment. Beneath all the slogans about unity and values, Europe now faces the simple choice of two economic models. 1. The current path is financialized, fragile, and dependent on imported energy and American protection. The other is developmental, self-reliant model focused on production, credit, infrastructure, and domestic value. That's the crossroads, and the clock is ticking. To rebuild, Europe would need to re-embrace nuclear power, secure energy independence, invest in real industry, control its borders, and adopt a diplomatic posture that reflects its interests, not someone else's. But if it keeps going the way it's going, outsourcing security to NATO, economy to Washington, and politics to bureaucracy, then Europe will continue trading autonomy for administration, competitiveness for compliance, and freedom for convenience. So the choice is still open for now: reclaim sovereignty and rebalance with a multipolar world, or fade quietly into managed decline. Coming up next, we turn to the voices of the ordinary people who see through the entire illusion, a message to NATO, to the EU, and to the so-called globalist architects of this crisis. That's Dear NATO and the EU, right after this break. Alright, now it's time to step out of the policy rooms and think tanks and the ivory towers, and let's hear from the people. Because while NATO generals and EU technocrats sit around dreaming up new enemies to justify their existence, while they warn us about Russian hackers, Chinese balloons, and Iranian threats, ordinary men and women are just trying to survive another month. This is, Dear NATO and EU, a fiery message from ordinary people. We're working, we're paying taxes, we're raising kids, and we're watching you burn through our livelihoods like they're disposable. Every time you sanction, every time you escalate, every time you ship billions to your proxy wars, you hammer another nail into the coffin of Europe's future. You talk about Russian aggression. No. You're the ones who turned the lights off across the continent. You're the ones who made heating a luxury. You're the ones who crushed small businesses under emergency measures, first in the name of health, and now in the name of war, and tomorrow it'll be in the name of climate. Did you ever once ask the people of Germany, France or Italy if they wanted to pay triple for gas? Did you ask British workers if they wanted another war to fund? No, because it's not you who freezes or struggles or starves. And the people now see it. They see it through suits, the slogans and the speeches. They know the truth. That the EU and NATO have become parasitic machines, fearmongers and warmongers wrapped in EU flags and fake virtue. You siphon off our money to fund your wars. You flood our countries with chaos and call it compassion. You censor our speech and call it safety. You indoctrinate our children and call it progress. You have turned freedom into a slogan and democracy into disguise for control. And then you have the audacity to demand loyalty, to tell us who to hate, who to fear, and who to blame for the crises you created. You tell us Russia is the enemy. You tell us China is plotting in the shadows. You tell us Iran and North Korea are the greatest threats. But we know the real threat sits much closer to home, in Brussels, in London, in Berlin, and in Washington. If you ask the ordinary people, really ask them who to trust more to protect their culture, their faith, their family, Putin or Macron, Xi or Starmer, your answers would terrify you. Because here's the truth. The propaganda isn't working anymore. You can't scare people into obedience forever. You can't bribe or censor your way out of reality. That's why enlistment is down. That's why protests are up. And that's why every poll across Europe shows the same thing. People are done with your lies. They don't want to die for your ideologies. They don't want to freeze for your values. They don't want to watch their countries drown under policies made by unelected bureaucrats who wouldn't last 1 week in the real world. And still, you double down. Still, you fantasize about new enemies, new threats, new wars to justify your existence. You point to the sky and see Russian balloons. You point to the sea and see Chinese submarines. You point to the internet and scream disinformation whenever someone dares to question you. But the truth is, we don't believe you anymore. You've cried wolf too many times. So here's the message, clear and simple, from ordinary people across the continent. We're done. We will no longer fight your wars. We will no longer fund your corruption. We will no longer be ruled by fear. You've taken our energy, our savings, our freedoms, and our futures, but you will not take our spirit, because when the people finally rise, when this tide truly turns, it won't be Russia or China you will fear. It'll be the citizens of your own nations standing before you and saying, no more. You have been warned. Okay, up next from the global stage back to the British Isles, the so-called Brit Card, London's shiny new digital ID scheme promising convenience but delivering control. We'll break down what it really means for privacy, freedom and the future of the UK right after this. Now let's move to the United Kingdom, where the cradle of democracy is quietly building its own digital cage. This is the Brit Card, a gateway to digital tyranny in the UK. In September 2025, Prime Minister Keir Starmer unveiled what his government calls the Brit Card, a new national digital ID system. It's being sold as a modern, convenient way to prove who you are, access public services, and supposedly tackle illegal immigration. Sounds harmless enough, right? An app on your phone, a digital wallet for your ID. What could go wrong? Well, everything. Because behind the sleek branding, the empty slogans about convenience lies something far more dangerous. A government-controlled digital identity network that could easily evolve into a tool for surveillance, censorship and exclusion. They tell you it's voluntary. They say it's about safety and efficiency. But look closer. It's the oldest trick in the book. Optional at first, compulsory later. The system is built on UK's so-called digital identity and attributes trust framework. Sounds technical, but what it really means is that your personal data, your biometrics, address, work history, even your movements can be stored, analysed and shared across approved databases. You won't be able to work, rent a home or access essential services without proving your digital identity. And if you refuse to sign up, you'll be locked out. That's not choice, that's coercion. When participation becomes the price of survival, voluntariness becomes a lie. Already, millions of business owners are being forced to undergo digital verification, setting a precedent of what's next. A nationwide rollout where everyone is tagged, scanned and scored. Today it's immigration, tomorrow it's employment, next week it's healthcare, transport, finance, even speech. That's the slope we're on. Now, the government insists that this isn't a national ID card, but if it walks like one, tracks like one, and punishes like one, it is one. The infrastructure already exists. Centralised database, biometric verification, GPS-linked smartphones, and automated trust checks. And Starmer's team didn't invent the system. They copied it from India's Aadhaar model, which has been plagued by massive data breaches, corruption, and identity theft. In India, millions of citizens lost access to welfare because of system errors. In Britain, the same could happen, not by accident, but by design, because the real power of the Brit Card isn't what it lets you do, it's what it can deny you. Let's talk about privacy, or rather the end of it. Your life in the system becomes a data set. Every interaction, your bank transfers, your travel history, your online activity, tied to a single digital identity. They'll tell you it's encrypted and safe, but no system is unhackable. Once your biometric data is leaked, your fingerprints, your face, your voice, it's gone forever. You can't change your DNA like you can change your password. And let's not forget, the UK already has the world's most invasive surveillance networks, facial recognition cameras, AI policing tools, and online censorship laws. Now imagine all that linked directly to your personal ID. Say the wrong thing online, the system knows. Attend a protest, the system flags you. Misspeak on social media, your trust rating drops. It's not a conspiracy theory, it's an architect of control being built piece by piece. This isn't about convenience, it's about compliance. And let's talk about the people this hurts the most. The elderly, the poor, the digitally excluded. What happens to those who don't have smartphones, or those who can't navigate these systems? They'll be locked out of basic life, unable to prove who they are, unable to access benefits, unable to travel. That's not modernisation, that's digital apartheid. The parallels with China's social credit system are impossible to ignore, a system where trust is calculated by an algorithm and your freedom depends on your obedience. Buy too much meat, you're flagged for carbon emissions. Criticise the government online, your ID is restricted. Protest, and your bank account is frozen. The UK is walking down the same road and doing it under the banner of progress. And here's the chilling part. It won't stop there. Once the infrastructure is built, it can be linked to everything. Your bank, your health record, your medical history, even your genetic data. And when the next crisis comes, whether it's pandemic, an energy shortage, or financial collapse, these tools can be instantly switched from administrative convenience to digital control. They can restrict your spending, your travel, your movement, all at the tap of a government dashboard, a prison without walls. This is where civil liberties groups from Big Brother Watch to privacy advocates across the spectrum are sounding the alarm. Over 2.8 million people have already signed petitions against the BRIC card, and they're right, because once you accept digital ID, you've handed the state the ultimate weapon, the ability to decide when and if you exist within the system. The BRIC card is not modernisation, it's digitised obedience. And if Britain, the birthplace of individual liberty, falls for this scam, you can be sure the rest of Europe will follow. So here's the bottom line. If you value your privacy, your autonomy, your freedom to think, speak and live without permission, resist it now, because by the time it's mandatory, it'll be too late. Well, it's been a tough double-header for Dynamo Minsk and St. Petersburg against the Shanghai Dragons, or as we remember them, the Kowloon Red Star. And this time the fire got better than the ice. 2 games in 3 days, both extremely close, 3-2 on the 9th and 2-1 on the 11th, both slipping just out of reach for the Bisons. In both matches, the story was the same. Dynamo looked strong at even strength, controlled the play and created plenty of chances. But the Dragons' power play was deadly. Every time Minsk went short-handed, Shanghai made them pay. The Bison's head coach summed it up well. The play in uneven numbers decided everything. And he's right. 3 goals conceded on the penalty kill in the first match, 2 more in the second. That's 5 of their last 6 against the power play. That's the difference right there. Still, there were positives. Zach Foucault was solid as ever between the pipes. Uzunov looked dangerous and the team never stopped pushing, especially in the third period of Game 1, when they had the Shanghai pinned in for nearly 10 minutes. But when you can't finish your chances, the game slips away. Alex Lemonge said it best after the rematch. We played well but couldn't find a way to win. The fans who came to support us gave so much energy. Now we go home, learn from it and start again. And that's exactly what they'll do. The team's back in Minsk now, regrouping and ready to turn the page. They'll face Shanghai again on the 24th, this time on home ice, and he bet the Bisons will be hungry for revenge. The next home game is on the 16th against Torpedo, and I'll be there. Alright, let's take a look at the action in St. Petersburg. Both games between Dynamo Minsk and Shanghai Dragons were tight, physical and full of big moments. Here's the Bison's goals on the doubleheader. Let's see how it unfolded on the ice.
Опа, Вэле проходит, бросает и забивает! Савье Вэле! Минчане реализуют свое большинство. Это один из лучших моментов в истории французского хоккея был. Савье Вэле! Большинство 1-2.
Вопрос, задела ли там шайба по пути к воротам Кореева. Может быть, кого-то из игроков и задела. Возможно, был рикошет от своего игрока. Поэтому Кореев не справился с дальним броском защитника минского «Динамо».
Но как он это исполнил?
Да, здесь здорово. Рисково, но получилось. Дальше бросок. Но здесь и Сомерби находился перед Кореевым, и игрок минчан. это был Милош. И видно, что Кореев не видел момент начала броска и траектории полета.
Бить, отскок. Усов, он вообще один остается. Усов, гол! И это 2-2. За 23 секунды до конца второго периода. Вот чуть-чуть подержал бы еще Усов. Одни двоечки бы остались на табло. Важнейшая шайба после сумасшедшего отрезка игры.
Да, команды, конечно, дали. До этого были в основном такие позиционные атаки с дальними бросками, набросами. А здесь выход 2 в 1 у драконов. Вот как раз. Затем у минчан выход 2 в 1 с догоняющим. Потом вот этот момент у драконов. А затем к шайбе приходит Кусову. И он здесь все здорово сделал. Ну, чуть-чуть не в позиции все же находился здесь Кореев. Не сумел он
будет сидеть или стоять там где-нибудь. О, здесь, если попал Лимош сейчас по шайбе, передача неплохая была. Вот бросок, это Смит, еще бросок и гол! И вот они забили все-таки. Это Сэм Энос открывает счет в этом матче. Минчане выходят вперед 1-0. Андрей Кореев перед вами.
Но в итоге вот этот план минского «Динамо» сработал на радость болельщиков, которых, кстати, на арене очень много. Там и автобусы организовывались, да и своим ходом, и поездами добирались. Очень большой сектор динамовских болельщиков на этом матче присутствует. Ну а что? Суббота, вполне можно комфортно съездить в Санкт-Петербург. А в плане моментов, ну смотрите, бросок раз, это два, а до этого еще был с острого угла вот этот вот прострел на синюю линию и попытка оттуда бросить. Короче, вот это вот наконец-то количество бросков просто переросло.
So there you have it, two hard-fought battles, both decided by the finest margins. The Bison showed heart, but the Dragons' power play made the difference this time. Still, no reason to hang heads. Dynamo's back home, the fans are behind them. And on October 24th in Minsk Arena, they'll have their shot at redemption. Because there's one thing we've learned about this team, they always come back stronger. Well, tonight, folks, we've seen the full picture from Russia's confrontation with the West to Europe's decline, America's overreach, and now Britain's descent into digital control. The systems of power are tightening, but awareness is growing faster. Stay alert, stay informed, stay free. This is From the Other Side, where truth heralds the dawn of awareness.